The park buzzed with life on that sunny afternoon, laughter and chatter blending with the rustling of leaves. Families picnicked under the shade of old oak trees, children raced across the grass, and joggers weaved through the winding paths. Among them was Marcus, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with a kind smile and a quiet presence. Dressed in a simple hoodie and track pants, he blended into the crowd like anyone else seeking a peaceful moment outdoors. But Marcus wasn't alone. A group of young men, loud and cocky, had been watching him from a nearby bench. Their laughter was sharp and pointed, their whispers growing louder as they sized him up. One of them, a wiry guy named Dylan, leaned forward and nudged his friend Jason. "Hey, check him out," Dylan said, his voice laced with mockery. "Man looks like he ate the whole park." Jason snickered, and soon the others joined in, their laughter cutting through the air. They didn't know Marcus. They didn't know his story, his struggles, or the countless hours he'd spent turning his pain into strength. To them, he was just an easy target, a big guy sitting alone, minding his business. Marcus heard them. He always heard them. Growing up, he learned to tune out the cruel comments, the sideways glances, the snickers that followed him in school hallways or grocery store aisles, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Today, though, Marcus wasn't about to let it ruin his peace. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and focused on the sounds of the park, the birds, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the children's laughter. But the group wasn't done. Emboldened by Marcus's silence, Dylan stood up and strutted toward him, his friends egging him on with cheers and laughter. "Hey, big guy," Dylan called out, loud enough to draw the attention of a few nearby parkgoers. "You lost, or you just here to scare off the squirrels?" The group erupted in laughter, and Marcus opened his eyes, his calm demeanor unshaken. He looked up at Dylan, who was now standing a few feet away, smirking like he just told the joke of the century. "Don't mind me," Marcus said evenly, his voice deep and calm. "I'm just here enjoying the day. Same as you." Dylan tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Enjoying the day? Man, with all that weight, I bet you haven't enjoyed much in years." The laughter from the bench grew louder, and a couple of onlookers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. Marcus, however, remained still, his eyes fixed on Dylan. "I'm not looking for trouble," Marcus said, his tone firm but measured. "Why don't you go back to your friends and leave me be?" Dylan took a step closer, puffing out his chest. "What if I don't? What if I feel like hanging out right here?" Marcus sighed, standing slowly. His full height dwarfed Dylan, but he made no sudden moves, no threatening gestures. He simply stood there, calm and composed, looking Dylan square in the eye. The air grew thick with tension, and even Dylan's friends seemed to quiet down, sensing the shift. "You should think carefully about what you're doing," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, "because you don't know who I am or what I'm capable of." Dylan laughed nervously, glancing back at his friends for support. "Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do? Sit on me?" More laughter erupted from the bench, but it was strained, uneasy. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his presence commanding and unyielding. For the first time, Dylan hesitated, the bravado slipping from his face as he realized he might have underestimated the man standing before him. "You think it's funny to mock people?" Marcus asked, his voice low and deliberate. "To make someone feel small just because you can. I've dealt with guys like you my whole life, but let me tell you something. You've picked the wrong person today." Dylan opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. Marcus's calm intensity was unlike anything he'd expected. The group on the bench watched in silence, their earlier laughter fading as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The park seemed to hold its breath, the distant sounds of laughter and play fading into the background. Marcus took a deep breath, then stepped back, giving Dylan space. "Walk away," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Before this goes somewhere you're not ready for." But Dylan, driven by pride and the pressure of his watching friends, clenched his fists, his face reddening. "You think you're tough, huh? Let's see what you've got, big man." Marcus' expression didn't change, but his stance shifted ever so slightly, a subtle readiness that spoke volumes. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry. He was prepared. And as the first hint of a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, it became clear that Dylan, and everyone watching, was about to learn exactly what Marcus was capable of. The crowd around the park began to grow, drawn in by the escalating tension. Parents pulling their children away from the swings, joggers slowing their pace, and a few dog walkers subtly leaning in, all curious about what might happen next. Marcus remained calm, his towering figure a stark contrast to Dylan's restless energy. For a moment, it seemed like Dylan might back down. His bravado faltered under the weight of Marcus's unwavering gaze. But the murmurs from his friends, the ones sitting on the bench, watching with wide-eyed anticipation, spurred him on. He couldn't lose face, not here, not in front of them. "Come on, man," Dylan said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite mask the nervous edge in his voice. "Show me what you've got. Unless all that talk is just bluffing." Marcus didn't move. He studied Dylan carefully, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The slight tremble in his hands, the way his weight shifted nervously from one foot to the other. Marcus had seen this kind of behavior before, countless times. Dylan wasn't a fighter. He was a provocateur, a man who thrived on the security of being surrounded by his pack. He was loud, but his confidence was paper-thin. "You don't want this," Marcus said finally, his voice as steady as ever. "Trust me. Walk away while you still can." But Dylan didn't walk away. Instead, he took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. The people watching seemed to hold their collective breath, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus's mind, however, wasn't focused on Dylan or the growing crowd. It was elsewhere, drifting to memories he hadn't revisited in years. Memories of a younger version of himself, sitting in the back of a school bus while kids hurled insults his way. The taunts had been relentless, about his weight, his skin, his quiet demeanor. He'd learned to endure it, to let the words wash over him like rain. But the pain had always lingered, buried deep where no one else could see. As he grew older, the bullying didn't stop, it simply evolved. By the time he hit his 20s, Marcus had realized that the world would always find a reason to judge him. It wasn't just about how he looked, it was about what he represented. To some, he was an easy target, a big, quiet man who didn't fight back. But they didn't know the full story. They didn't know how the years of ridicule had shaped him, how he'd spent countless nights channeling his anger and frustration into something constructive. Marcus had discovered martial arts almost by accident, walking past a small dojo on his way home from work one evening. Intrigued, he'd stepped inside and watched a class in progress. The movements were precise, disciplined, and powerful. Everything he felt he wasn't at the time, but something about it called to him. And before he knew it, he'd signed up for his first lesson. That was years ago. Since then, Marcus had transformed, not just physically, but mentally. The dojo became his sanctuary, a place where he could shed the weight of the world and focus on himself. He trained relentlessly, learning not just how to fight, but how to control his emotions, how to find peace in the chaos. The irony wasn't lost on him now, standing in the park, face to face with someone who reminded him so much of the bullies from his past. Dylan was a reflection of every person who had underestimated him, every person who had tried to make him feel small. And Marcus knew better than to let the moment get the best of him. Dylan squared his shoulders, misinterpreting Marcus's silence as hesitation. "What's the matter?" he sneered, afraid to throw a punch. Marcus took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. The crowd murmured, a few people pulling out their phones to record what they hoped would be a dramatic confrontation. But Marcus wasn't interested in putting on a show. He wasn't interested in fighting at all, unless he had no other choice. "You want to fight me?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "For what?" "So you can impress your friends, so you can feel like a man." Dylan faltered, the questions catching him off guard. He opened his mouth to respond but found he had no answer. Marcus pressed on, his tone unwavering. "Let me tell you something," Marcus said, his eyes locked on Dylan's. "Being a man isn't about throwing punches or tearing people down. It's about lifting others up, showing respect, and knowing when to walk away. What you're doing right now, it doesn't make you strong. It makes you weak." Dylan blinked, the words hitting harder than any punch ever could. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like he might listen, like the weight of Marcus' words was sinking in. But then, a voice from the bench cut through the silence. "Don't let him talk to you like that, Dylan." One of his friends shouted, "Show him who's boss." The spell was broken. Dylan's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he fed off the encouragement from his friends. He took another step forward, his fists tightening. "You think you're better than me?" Dylan spat, his voice rising. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." Marcus' expression softened, and for the first time, he saw the pain hidden behind Dylan's anger. It was a pain he recognized all too well. A pain that came from trying to prove yourself in a world that seemed determined to tear you down. "I don't know you," Marcus admitted, his tone gentler now. "But I know this path you're on. I've been there. And I'm telling you, it doesn't lead anywhere good." The crowd watched in hushed anticipation, the tension between the two men palpable. Dylan's friends were shouting at him to make a move, but he hesitated, his fists trembling at his sides. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw more than just a big guy standing in his way. He saw someone who understood him, someone who'd been through the fire and come out stronger. But Dylan's pride wouldn't let him back down. Not yet. With a frustrated growl, he took one last step forward, raising his fist as the crowd gasped. And then, in a blur of movement so quick it was almost imperceptible, Marcus stepped to the side, his body fluid and controlled. He didn't strike Dylan. He didn't even touch him. Instead, he let the younger man's momentum carry him forward, unbalanced and vulnerable. Dylan stumbled, catching himself just before hitting the ground, his face a mix of shock and humiliation. Marcus turned to face him, his stance relaxed but ready. "That was your one chance," he said quietly. "Don't make me give you another." The park fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavy in the air. Dylan straightened up, his face red with embarrassment and frustration. He looked at Marcus, then at the crowd, and finally back at his friends who were no longer laughing. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like the fight might finally be over. Dylan stood there, fists clenched by his sides, his pride dangling by a thread. The crowd watched in tense silence, their collective energy a mix of curiosity, unease, and quiet anticipation. Marcus remained still, his calm yet commanding presence unshaken by the storm brewing in front of him. In the back of the crowd, an older man with a weathered face and a small dog at his feet shook his head, muttering to himself. He'd seen this kind of thing before, young men with too much to prove and not enough sense to know when to back down. A few other parkgoers whispered amongst themselves, their concern mingling with the undeniable pull of the unfolding drama. Dylan's friends, meanwhile, were caught between their loyalty to him and the dawning realization that this wasn't going to end the way they'd imagined. Jason, the one who had been the loudest just moments ago, now shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence replaced with nervous glances at the crowd. "Come on, Dylan," Jason called out finally, his voice hesitant. "Let's go, this guy isn't worth it." But Dylan wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on Marcus, his face a mask of anger and frustration. He felt trapped, not just by the crowd or by Marcus's unyielding presence, but by the weight of his own choices. He couldn't back down now, not after coming this far, not with everyone watching. "I'm not scared of you," Dylan said, his voice shaky but defiant. "You think you're better than me. You're just some guy sitting in a park, acting all high and mighty." Marcus didn't respond right away. He could see the cracks in Dylan's facade, the insecurity hiding beneath the bravado. It reminded him of a time years ago when he'd stood in Dylan's place, not in a physical confrontation, but in the quiet battles he fought with himself. "You're not scared of me," Marcus said finally, his tone even. "You're scared of what this moment means. You're scared of looking weak. I get it. But real strength isn't about proving yourself to strangers. It's about knowing when to walk away." Dylan's jaw tightened, but the words hit their mark. For a split second, his eyes flickered with something other than anger, something that looked a lot like doubt, but just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same fiery determination that had brought him to this point. Before Dylan could respond, a woman's voice cut through the tension. "Dylan, stop it." The crowd parted slightly as a young woman stepped forward, her expression a mix of frustration and worry. She was petite, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail and a determined set to her jaw. It was clear she knew Dylan, maybe better than anyone else there, and her presence seemed to throw him off balance. "Jessica, stay out of this," Dylan said, his voice a mix of anger and embarrassment. "No," she shot back, her eyes flashing. "You're making a fool of yourself. Look around, Dylan. Do you really think this is how you prove a point? By picking a fight with someone who doesn't even want to fight you?" Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. For the first time, Dylan seemed to falter, his gaze shifting from Marcus to Jessica and back again. The crowd watched, waiting to see what he would do next. Marcus, meanwhile, studied the interaction with quiet interest. He could see the connection between Dylan and Jessica, the way her words carried weight even when he didn't want to hear them. It reminded Marcus of his younger sister, who had been one of the few people to pull him back from the brink during his darkest moments. "Listen to her," Marcus said softly, his tone no longer commanding but encouraging. "She's trying to help you. Let her." Dylan's friends exchanged uneasy dances, their earlier bravado fading into awkward silence. Jason, who had been the first to suggest leaving, took a hesitant step forward. "Dylan, man, let's just go," Jason said, his voice low. "She's right. This isn't worth it." But Dylan wasn't ready to let go, not yet. He turned back to Marcus, his expression a mix of frustration and desperation. "You don't know what it's like," Dylan said, his voice cracking. "You don't know what it's like to always feel like you're not enough, to feel like the whole world is against you." The words hum in the air, raw and unfiltered, and for the first time, the crowd seemed to see Dylan not as an aggressor, but as someone struggling under the weight of his own insecurities. Marcus' expression softened, and he took a small step closer, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know your story, but I do know what it's like to feel small, to feel like you have to fight just to be seen. I'm telling you, this isn't the way. You don't have to prove anything to me or anyone else here." Dylan stared at Marcus, his fists still clenched, his breathing heavy. The tension in the air was nearly unbearable, the crowd holding its collective breath as they waited to see what he would do. Jessica stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Dylan's arm. "Please, Dylan," she said softly. "Let it go." For a long moment, Dylan didn't move. His face was a storm of emotions: anger, shame, confusion. But slowly, the tension in his body began to ease. His fists unclenched, his shoulders relaxed, and the fire in his eyes dimmed. The crowd seemed to release a collective sigh of relief, the heavy tension in the air dissipating like a passing storm. Dylan turned to Jessica, his expression tired and defeated. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Jessica nodded, giving his arm a reassuring squeeze before leading him away from the crowd. His friends followed, that earlier bravado replaced with sheepish silence. Marcus watched them go, his expression unreadable. As the crowd began to disperse, he turned and walked to the nearest bench, sitting down with a quiet sigh. The park returned to its usual rhythm, the sounds of laughter and conversation gradually filling the air once more. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story, that Dylan's battle wasn't just with him, but with something far deeper. And as he sat there, watching the world move on around him, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd done enough to make a difference. The evening sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park as Marcus sat on the bench, deep in thought. Despite the situation diffusing, a strange unease lingered. He couldn't ignore the way Dylan had looked at him before walking away, an expression of defeat, yes, but also one of unresolved anger and frustration. It was the kind of look Marcus recognized all too well from his own past, the feeling of being cornered by life and unsure of how to fight back. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to shake off the sense of foreboding. He reminded himself that he'd done his part. He didn't want trouble, and he certainly didn't want to escalate the situation further. Yet, even as he tried to focus on the tranquility of the park, the voices of doubt and concern nagged at him. Was Dylan really done, or was this just the calm before another storm? Across the park, Dylan paced back and forth near a cluster of trees, his friends hovering a few steps behind him. Jessica sat on a nearby bench, watching him with a mix of concern and frustration. She had hoped that walking away would be the end of it, but Dylan's restless energy told her otherwise. He was still seething, his pride bruised and his emotions running high. "Dylan, you need to stop," Jessica said firmly, her voice cutting through the murmurs of his friends. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Not him. Not these people, no one." Dylan stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression a mix of hurt and defiance. "You don't understand, Jess. This isn't about him. It's about me. Every time I walk into a room, every time I step outside, people see me and think they know who I am. They judge me before I even open my mouth." Jessica softened, her frustration giving way to empathy. "I know it's hard, Dylan. I know people can be cruel, but fighting him won't fix that. It won't change the way people see you." Dylan shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It's not about changing their minds. It's about not letting them walk all over me. If I back down now, what does that say about me? That I'm weak? That I can't stand up for myself?" Jason, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, stepped forward hesitantly. "Dylan, man, no one thinks you're weak. But maybe Jessica's right. Maybe this isn't the way." Dylan glanced at Jason, his expression softening slightly, but the fire in his eyes didn't fade. "You don't get it, Jason. None of you do. I've been fighting my whole life, fighting to be seen, to be respected. I'm not just going to sit back and let some guy humiliate me in front of everyone." Back at the bench, Marcus felt the shift in the air before he saw it. He looked up to see Dylan walking purposefully across the park, his friends trailing behind him, their earlier hesitance replaced by quiet resignation. Marcus's heart sank. He had hoped Dylan would let it go, but it was clear that wasn't going to happen. As Dylan approached, Marcus stood, his posture calm but alert. The chatter of the park quieted again as people turned their attention back to the brewing confrontation. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. "Why are you doing this, Dylan?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but tinged with wariness. "You walked away. You had nothing to prove. So why come back?" Dylan stopped a few feet away, his chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. "Because I can't let this go," he said, his voice low but firm. "I can't let you think you've won." "This isn't about winning," Marcus said, his tone unwavering. "It's about making a choice. You can choose to keep fighting a battle that doesn't need to be fought, or you can choose to walk away and focus on what really matters." Dylan's hands curled into fists at his sides, his body tense with unspent energy. "You don't know what matters to me," he shot back. "You don't know anything about me." "You're right," Marcus said, taking a small step closer. "I don't know your story, but I know this isn't who you are. You're not a bully. You're not someone who picks fights just to feel strong. I saw it in your eyes earlier. You're better than this." For a moment, Dan hesitated, his resolve wavering. But then, as if a switch had flipped, his expression hardened. "You don't know me," he repeated, his voice colder this time. "You don't get to tell me who I am." The crowd watched with bated breath, their attention glued to the scene unfolding before them. Some whispered to each other, speculating on what would happen next, while others remained silent, their eyes darting between Marcus and Dylan. Marcus sighed, his own patience beginning to wear thin. "If this is really what you want, Dylan," he said quietly, "then let's get it over with. But just know that this isn't going to end the way you think it will." Dylan's friends exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Jessica stood a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a mix of frustration and helplessness. She wanted to intervene to stop this before it went any further, but she knew Dylan well enough to realize he wasn't going to back down. The park seemed to hold its breath as Dylan took another step closer, his fists clenched and his gaze locked on Marcus. The tension was unbearable, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone watching. Marcus stood his ground, his calm demeanor unwavering, but inside he felt the storm building. And then, just as Dylan raised his fist, a voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Enough." Everyone turned to see the older man with the weathered face and the small dog stepping forward. His voice was firm, his eyes sharp despite his age. "This isn't the way, son," he said, his gaze fixed on Dylan. "You think fighting him will make you feel better. It won't. It'll just make you feel emptier." Dylan froze, his arm dropping to his side as he looked at the man, confusion flickering across his face. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Someone who's been where you are," the man replied, "and someone who knows that this path leads nowhere good." The crowd murmured softly, their attention now split between Dylan, Marcus, and the mysterious older man. The suspense hung thick in the air, every moment feeling like an eternity as they waited to see what would happen next.